The August heat in Charleston pressed down on everything like a wet wool blanket. The afternoon I pushed open the door to my home office and stopped cold. Nothing dramatic. No ransacked drawers. No broken glass. Just my desk. The same mahogany desk where I drafted contracts for 31 years as a real estate attorney, with something subtly, undeniably wrong. The manila folder holding my property deed had been moved. Not by much. Maybe 2 inches to the left. But I'd kept that folder in the same spot since my wife passed 3 years ago, and I knew every inch of that desk the way I knew my own face in the mirror. The leather chair sat at an angle I never left it. The small brass key I kept under the edge of the desk blotter was gone. I set my grocery bag down slowly, stood there, let my eyes catalog every detail the way 31 years of due diligence had taught me. My filing cabinet, the 2-drawer one with the lock I'd installed myself in 1998, had fresh scratches around the keyhole. Amateur work. Like someone had tried a paperclip or a letter opener. Someone who didn't know that I noticed everything. Someone who assumed that because I was 63 and walked with a slight limp from my knee replacement, I had stopped paying attention. I sat in my chair and folded my hands on the desk and let the realization move through me like cold water. My son had been living in my house for 4 months. So had his wife. That evening at dinner, the question came the way it always comes, wrapped in concern, disguised as love. My son cleared his throat and said, "Dad, I've been thinking. Your estate planning. Have you updated anything recently?" He kept his eyes on his plate when he said it. That told me everything. I put my fork down with precise, deliberate care. Looked at him. Then at my daughter-in-law. She was better at it than he was. She met my gaze directly. Her expression arranged into something warm and reasonable. She said she'd read an article about how important it was for people. She paused just slightly before the next words at a certain stage of life to have things clearly organized. For everybody's protection, she said. Avoid confusion later. Confusion about what? I asked. She blinked. Oh, property, accounts, just making sure everything's documented properly. I took a long sip of water. I'd spent 3 decades reading people across conference tables, reading the way their hands moved, the way they breathed before they lied. My daughter-in-law was good, but her left thumb was pressing hard against her right palm under the table. I could see it in the slight shift of her shoulder. My son was watching her the way a man watches someone who knows more than he does. I nodded slowly and said that was probably a good idea. Said I'd think about it. Said the pot roast was excellent. After dinner, they sat together on the couch. Heads close, voices low. I pretended to read. What I was actually doing was watching their reflections in the dark window behind the television. My daughter-in-law touched my son's arm twice. The second time, he nodded and pulled out his phone. Whatever he typed, she read over his shoulder and approved with one small dip of her chin. I turned a page I hadn't read. That night I lay on my back in the dark, staring at the ceiling fan, and did the arithmetic they were already doing. The house had been appraised at $840,000 the previous spring. Charleston real estate didn't slow down for anything. The investment accounts my wife and I had built over 40 years sat at a little over $600,000. The lake property in North Carolina that her father had left her, that I'd kept because I couldn't bear to sell it, added another $250 conservatively. That was the number they were looking at. That was the number that had put the scratches around my filing cabinet lock. I was up before sunrise. I went through my office methodically. 3 files had been disturbed. My will was there but had clearly been read. The pages had that particular slight softness that paper gets when it's been handled. 2 letters from my investment broker were missing entirely. I checked the postal tracking on my phone. Both showed delivered 9 days ago. I stood at my filing cabinet and let the anger move through me like a current. Then I locked it deep, where it couldn't interfere with clear thinking. Here's what 31 years handling real estate fraud teaches you. Emotion is the enemy of evidence. Rage makes you move too fast. Moving too fast makes you lose. I needed information first. And to get information, I needed them to believe they had the advantage. 2 days later, over breakfast, I set the trap. I said I'd been thinking about visiting my college roommate up in Asheville. Hadn't seen him in years. Maybe 2 weeks. Give or take. My son's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. My daughter-in-law's reaction was faster and smoother. She said that sounded wonderful, that I deserved a break, that I shouldn't worry about a single thing at home, shouldn't worry about a thing at home. I filed those words carefully. My son asked if the drive wasn't too long for me to manage alone. He tried to make it sound like concern. Almost succeeded. I told him I'd driven that road for 30 years. He relaxed in a way he shouldn't have let me see. I spent the morning moving around the house the way a man would who was genuinely preparing for a trip. Suitcase from the closet. Toiletries on the bathroom counter. My old road atlas spread on the kitchen table. Each prop chosen for authenticity. Hidden in the duffel bag under the suitcase. A pair of binoculars I'd borrowed from my neighbor Harold. A small digital camera. A legal pad still half full of blank pages. The tools of observation underneath the costume of retirement. The afternoon I loaded the car, my daughter-in-law helped me carry the heavier bag and held the door. She kissed my cheek when I left. Her perfume was new, expensive, something she hadn't been wearing a month ago. I registered it without letting anything show on my face. My son stood in the driveway, hugged me goodbye with arms that were slightly too stiff. The way you hold someone when you're thinking about something other than holding them. I told him to take care of things while I was gone. He said, "We will, Dad. We will." In the rearview mirror, I watched them until I turned the corner. The moment they thought I was out of sight, my daughter-in-law said something that made my son laugh. He put his arm around her shoulders. They were already celebrating. I drove 20 minutes to the extended stay motel off I-26, the kind that takes cash and doesn't ask questions. Registered under a name I hadn't used in 30 years. Room 114. The air conditioning rattled. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited for dark. Harold lived directly across the street from my house. We'd been neighbors for 19 years. He was 74, a retired Navy commander who still kept a logbook of unusual neighborhood activity, the way some men keep a daily planner out of habit, and because it gave his mornings purpose. I'd told him only that I was worried about a possible break-in and asked if he'd keep an eye on things. He'd agreed, without asking follow-up questions. Harold was like that. I drove back after midnight, parked 4 blocks away, walked through the summer heat. Harold had left his garage side door unlocked for me. His second-floor guest room faced my house directly, and from the window I could see every light in every room. All of them were on. I raised the binoculars. My daughter-in-law was at the kitchen table with a folder open in front of her. My folder. The red one from the back of my filing cabinet that held the property documents I'd never shared with anyone, not since my wife. My son paced the length of the living room, phone pressed to his ear, free hand making sharp, hurried gestures. He was talking to someone who was giving him instructions. My jaw tightened, but my hands stayed steady. I'd spent 3 decades keeping my hands steady at the worst moments of the worst negotiations. I wasn't about to lose that now. I heard the door open behind me. I spun around and found Harold standing in the doorway, holding 2 mugs of coffee, perfectly calm, as though he'd expected to find me there all along. He said he'd seen my car come back 2 nights ago as well. I started to explain. He held up a hand and said he didn't need an explanation. Said he'd been watching my house since the day I'd asked him to, and that he had some things to tell me. He set the mugs on the windowsill and pulled a small spiral notebook from his shirt pocket. Harold kept logs in the same, compressed, precise style he'd used at sea. Dates, times, descriptions. A man in a blue Mercedes had come 3 times. First visit, Tuesday the 6th, 11:17 in the morning, 40 minutes. Second visit, Thursday the 8th, 9:52, 35 minutes. Third visit, 2 days ago, this time after dark. He'd arrived at 11:43 p.m. He arrived with a briefcase, Harold said. Left without it. I looked at him. He looked at me. We'd been neighbors 19 years. He didn't need me to explain what that meant. He pulled his phone from his pocket and showed me a photograph taken through his own window with his camera's telephoto lens. The man, captured clearly in the glow of my porch light, shaking my son's hand at the door. Dark suit, silver hair, the particular posture of a man who does this kind of thing regularly. Harold said he'd run the plate. Old Navy habit. Looked the name up online. He turned the phone so I could read it. Raymond Whitfield. real estate broker, Whitfield Property Group, licensed in South Carolina, and 3 other states. I stood there for a moment with that name settling into my memory the way evidence settles into a case file. I said, "You ran his plate?" Harold said the man had parked in front of a fire hydrant. He was just being civic-minded. I almost smiled. Almost. We settled in at the window with the coffee. Harold pulled a second chair from the corner without being asked. We watched in silence while the city cooled around us. The hour hand moved past 1. Then 2. My back ached from the borrowed chair. My eyes burned. Harold refilled the mugs from a thermos he'd apparently brought up earlier, which told me he'd been planning to stay the whole time. I asked him why he was doing this. He looked at the window rather than at me when he answered. He said his daughter had taken his savings account while he was recovering from his bypass. Said he'd let it go because she was his daughter and he loved her, and he told himself she'd needed it. Said he spent 3 years knowing it had been wrong and doing nothing. He said he was done doing nothing when he saw it happening to someone else. We didn't speak for a while after that. Sometimes there's nothing useful to say. At 2:10, headlights swept the street. A dark blue Mercedes. Harold touched my arm. The car pulled to the curb in front of my house. Raymond Whitfield got out, checked his watch, looked both directions on the empty street with the careful awareness of a man who knows that midnight meetings are unusual. My front door opened before he could knock. My son had been watching for him. They went inside. Through my living room window, I could now see 3 figures. I raised the binoculars. Harold raised his phone and began photographing with a steadiness that told me he'd done difficult things in the dark before. My daughter-in-law appeared from the hallway carrying my red folder, the one from my filing cabinet. She set it on the dining room table like it was hers to carry. Harold said, quietly, that he'd gotten clear photos of each of Whitfield's visits, all time-stamped. I said, "Good. We're going to need them." We watched Whitfield review documents under my dining room light, holding pages up, tilting them against the lamp, checking watermarks, checking signatures. He knew what to look for in legitimate paperwork, which meant he also knew how to spot fraudulent paperwork and had made his peace with it. My son sat across from him. He couldn't hold still, shoulders moving, hands shifting, unable to make eye contact for more than a second. Every cell in his body broadcasting what his face was trying to hide. My daughter-in-law sat without moving, confident. When Whitfield asked something, I could see her lips shape an answer with the economy of someone who has rehearsed. She believed they had covered every angle. She had no idea I was 150 feet away watching her think that. Papers were pushed across the table. My son signed something. Then my daughter-in-law. Whitfield gathered the documents and placed them in his briefcase with practiced efficiency. Then my daughter-in-law went to the kitchen and came back with a bottle. 3 glasses. I recognized the shape. It was the scotch my wife's brother had given me for my 60th birthday. I'd been saving it. They poured. They raised their glasses together. Harold put his phone down and looked at me. I looked at him. There was nothing to say about the scotch that wouldn't have required me to put the binoculars down and stop watching, so I didn't say anything. I photographed the toast instead. Whitfield left at 2:45. He and my son and daughter-in-law stood briefly in the front doorway before he walked to his car. Harold had his window cracked an inch. The night was warm and still, and their voices carried. Whitfield said, "If the power of attorney holds up, we close September 15th. The buyer's offering $790 cash. No contingencies." My son said, "It'll hold up. He signed it himself 6 months ago." The lie settled into me like something cold. I had signed nothing. No power of attorney, no authorization, no permission for any transaction involving my property. The document was forged. The only question was how good the forgery was. My daughter-in-law said, in a voice that was perfectly smooth, "Everything is in order. We've been very careful. Very careful." I photographed them saying it. Whitfield shook hands, got in his Mercedes, and drove away. My son said something to my daughter-in-law as they went back inside. She laughed. Musical. Triumphant. The sound carried clearly in the night. Harold closed his window. I stood in his guest room with my phone in my hand, looking at the photographs, thinking about the number 790,000 and what someone decides they are willing to do for it. I told Harold I had everything I needed for now. I needed him to keep watching when I couldn't be here. I needed him to be willing to testify if it came to that. He said he'd already thought about that. Said he'd been thinking about it since the second time the Mercedes came. I thanked him. He told me not to thank him yet. Said first I needed to build something they couldn't argue their way out of. I drove back to the motel before dawn. Spread everything on the bed. Camera in my pocket. Harold's phone photos forwarded to my email. Legal pad ready. In the morning I put on the suit I'd packed. Charcoal gray. The tie my wife had given me for our anniversary the year before she got sick. I drove downtown and parked in front of the building where my attorney had her office on the 4th floor. She'd been my colleague for 12 years before she went into estate law full-time. I trusted her the way you trust someone you've watched work under pressure. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said the solution was a revocable trust that morning and an irrevocable asset protection trust by end of business. My property transferred into it with me as sole trustee before the close of any business day I chose. I said I wanted it backdated to April. She gave me a look, then looked at her notes, then looked at me again. She understood without needing an explanation. She was a professional. She said, "Once we file, no power of attorney issued in your name regardless of date can authorize a sale of property held in the trust. You're the only authorized party." I said that was exactly right. She had the documents drafted by noon, filed electronically with the county recorder at 3:40 p.m. that same afternoon. By the time my son and my daughter-in-law sat down to dinner in my house that evening, the property they were trying to sell was legally untouchable. The trap had closed. They just didn't know it yet. 3 days later, I drove home. I'd timed it for mid-afternoon, when my daughter-in-law would have finished her errands and my son would have been back from wherever he went on Tuesdays. I pulled into my own driveway like any man returning from a trip that hadn't agreed with him. The curtain in the front window moved before I'd turned the engine off. I took my time with the suitcase, moved slowly toward the door, letting my limp do a little more work than it usually needed to. My key found the lock on the first try. My son appeared from the kitchen in seconds. His face caught in that fraction of a second between genuine surprise and the trained expression he pulled over it like a mask. He said I was back early, said was everything all right. Behind him, my daughter-in-law came down the stairs. She was calculating something in her eyes. I could see it. They had a closing date of September 15th. Today was the 1st. 14 days. They still thought they had time. I said the altitude bothered my knee. Said my own bed sounded better than another week in a strange mattress. Said it was good to be home. She said that made sense. Said it was probably smart to come back. Her voice was warm with a practiced quality. That evening's dinner became a different kind of work. My son started with what he thought was subtlety. Said he'd noticed I'd seemed a little forgetful lately. Put it gently, the way you'd tell a man bad news you hoped he wouldn't examine too closely. A few little things, he said. Misplaced items. Getting dates mixed up. I set my fork down and looked at him steadily. Said I couldn't think of any specific example. My daughter-in-law leaned forward. Said it was completely normal. Nothing to be embarrassed about. Said a doctor's visit might put everyone's mind at ease. Said they were asking because they cared about me. I touched my temple like I was trying to remember something. Said maybe she was right. Said I had been a bit scattered. I felt the shape of what they were building. They were constructing a defense before they'd been accused of anything. If the forged power of attorney was ever questioned, they would say, I'd signed it and forgotten. Cognitive decline. The old man didn't know what he was agreeing to. It was simultaneously the most cowardly strategy I'd ever encountered and, from their perspective, the most logical one. What they didn't know was that my phone had been recording since I'd sat down at the table. After dinner, I walked past their bedroom door and heard their voices through the gap at the bottom. My son said, he doesn't even remember signing. My daughter-in-law said, that's perfect. If he tries to fight this later, we point to exactly what we saw tonight. He can't keep track of things anymore. My son said, you really think this goes through? She said, 14 more days. Then we're done. I stood in the dark hallway with my phone at waist level, recording every word. They had no idea that the man they thought was losing his mind was standing 3 feet from their door, building a federal-grade fraud case against them. Back in my office, I transferred the audio to my laptop, sent an encrypted copy to my attorney with a subject line that read, "Evidence of consciousness of guilt, recorded September 1st. Her reply came 20 minutes later. "This is significant. They're establishing a false narrative to cover prior knowledge of fraud. See you on the 15th. I arranged everything that night. 5 folders, color-coded, labeled. The first held Harold's photographs, and my own every documented visit by Whitfield, time-stamped, his face clear in each one. The second held the Asset Protection Trust documents with the county filing stamp, proof that the property was transferred before any power of attorney could have been executed. The third held the forged power of attorney itself, which I'd photographed during my visit to the house while they were out. Alongside it, a comparative signature analysis I'd prepared myself. 31 years of authenticating real estate documents teaches you the language of forgery better than most handwriting experts. The pressure differential was wrong. The way I formed the loop on the G in my signature, practiced since law school, was subtly off. Someone had studied my signature carefully and gotten close, but not close enough. The fourth folder held the audio recordings from dinner and from the hallway, transcribed and time-stamped. The fifth folder held something I hadn't expected to find when I'd photographed the documents in their room. Printed emails between my daughter-in-law and someone in Atlanta she called by first name only. The messages were direct. After the closing, she wrote, "I'll have my half. 400 and change. Enough to start over somewhere new." My son thought they were selling my house to fund a new life together in Charlotte. He had no idea she was planning to leave him the day the money cleared. He thought he was her partner. She thought he was a tool. I sat with that for a long time. Then I put it in the fifth folder. The morning of September 15th, I dressed in my charcoal suit. The same one. The tie my wife had given me. I picked up my briefcase, the one I'd carried into closings for 3 decades, and walked into the kitchen where they were finishing coffee. I said I had some errands. Said I'd be back later. They smiled. Relieved. They thought I was going to the pharmacy. In 3 hours, they would be sitting across a conference table expecting to sign papers that would put $790,000 in their bank account. I drove to my attorney's office first. She was waiting in the lobby with her own briefcase and the particular focused expression I recognized from every difficult negotiation I'd ever watched her run. We drove together to the title company on Broad Street. Through the glass wall of the conference room, I could see them already assembled. Whitfield at the head of the table, arranging documents with the ease of a man who'd closed dozens of transactions and wasn't troubled by the ethics of any of them. My son and daughter-in-law on the left side of the table, dressed carefully. The nervous energy of people on the edge of something they'd planned too long radiating from every small movement. The buyer, a heavy-set man from Atlanta who'd flown in for the closing, sat across from them with the impatient look of someone who'd wired a deposit and expected a clean transaction. The title company attorney sat at the far end, papers arranged in front of her. Normal. Just another residential closing. My attorney put her hand on the door. I said, "Let's go." Every head turned when we entered. The room went from the low murmur of closing day small talk to complete silence in the space of one breath. I watched my daughter-in-law's face go from confidence to something she wasn't able to arrange in time. I watched my son rise halfway from his chair and catch himself. Whitfield looked confused. The buyer looked annoyed. The title attorney looked worried. I walked to the empty end of the table and set my briefcase down with a click that rang through the room. I said, "I'm the current owner of the property you're attempting to purchase. This transaction cannot proceed. The power of attorney you're relying on is a forgery." My daughter-in-law said, very quietly, that this wasn't what it looked like. I turned to the title attorney and handed her the first folder. Told her to review the trust documents before anything else. She opened it. Read. Looked up at Whitfield. Asked whether he'd conducted a title search before scheduling the closing. The color in Whitfield's face changed. He said the power of attorney had appeared legitimate. Standard documentation. My attorney said that standard documentation would have included a title search revealing the irrevocable trust filed with the county in April. She slid the filing documents across the table. As sole trustee, she said, my client is the only party authorized to conduct any transaction involving this property. The power of attorney, regardless of its date, is legally meaningless. The buyer stood up. He looked at Whitfield with the expression of a man who has just understood he's been brought into someone else's problem. He said he'd been assured the documentation was clean. He said he'd wired funds based on that assurance. He started talking about his attorney. I opened the second folder, spread Harold's photographs on the table, explained what each one documented: the 3 visits, the late-night meeting, my daughter-in-law removing my private files from my filing cabinet, my son signing papers at my own dining room table without my knowledge or consent. My attorney slid copies to the title attorney, said all images were time-stamped and verified. My son found his voice. He said we could talk about this. Said if I just came home with them, we could work it out. I looked at him, held his eyes until he looked away. I told him he'd stop being just my son the night he let someone use my house as a bargaining chip. I opened the third folder, placed the forged power of attorney next to a copy of my genuine signature from a document I'd executed publicly in 2019, pointed to the G, the pressure differential, the specific error that proved beyond any professional doubt that the document was fraudulent. My daughter-in-law said she didn't know what I was suggesting. I opened the fourth folder. The title attorney heard the audio recording with the room completely silent. My son's voice. My daughter-in-law's voice. 14 more days. Then we're done. He doesn't even remember signing. The buyer was on his phone. I opened the fifth folder and placed the printed emails on the table where everyone could read them. I said nothing. Let the words do the work. My son read the first 3 lines, then stopped reading and looked at his wife. She didn't look back at him. The silence in that room was the kind that happens when several people are simultaneously understanding something they didn't know until this moment. The title attorney said the closing could not proceed. Said she was required to report suspected fraud to the appropriate authorities. Said she was ending the session. Whitfield said he had been deceived. The buyer said something about his attorney's number. My son said my name once, the way he'd said it when he was small and had done something he needed me to forgive. I closed my briefcase, turned to my attorney. She opened the conference room door. I walked out without looking back. In the elevator, she said, "That was thorough." I said, "It needed to be." She asked what came next. I told her. Police report that afternoon. Formal criminal fraud complaint. Injunction to protect the accounts. New locks on the house before dark. The elevator doors opened to the lobby. Afternoon light came through the glass front of the building, broad and hot and clean the way Charleston light is in September. Harold was sitting in a chair near the entrance. He'd come without being asked, which meant he'd understood, without needing to be told, that a man shouldn't walk out of something like that alone. He stood up when he saw me, didn't say anything. We walked out into the heat together. The weeks that followed moved the way legal processes move with exhausting slowness, and then, suddenly, with the decisiveness of a door closing, my son cooperated early, gave a full statement, said he'd trusted her, said he'd told himself it wasn't really fraud because I would have agreed if they'd asked me. I understood that logic. I'd seen it in defendants for 30 years. The story people tell themselves so they can keep going. The thing is, he'd had the chance to ask me. He'd chosen not to. The choice, not the outcome, was the crime. My daughter-in-law maintained she'd done nothing wrong until they showed her the emails. Then she said it was my son's idea, and she'd been pressured. They turned on each other the way people always do when the deal falls apart, each one trying to be the one who goes home. In the end, it doesn't usually work that way for either of them. Whitfield lost his license pending investigation. The buyer recovered his deposit and filed a civil claim that Whitfield's attorneys were still contesting when I stopped following it. The eviction hearing was October 3rd. The judge reviewed the evidence and issued the order in 40 minutes, 14 days to vacate. On moving day, my son came to the door alone. My daughter-in-law was already gone, had taken what she considered hers, and left without saying goodbye to either of us. He stood on the porch, older looking than he'd been 6 months ago. He said he was sorry. He said it the way people say it when they understand that sorry doesn't reach what they've broken. I told him I knew he was. Told him that wasn't the same as it being undone. He asked if we were finished. I told him I didn't know the answer to that yet. Told him that he had some time ahead of him to figure out who he wanted to be, and that what he decided would tell us both more than what either of us said standing on that porch. He nodded, walked to the moving truck. I closed the door and stood in the hallway of my own house in the silence. The sentencing came in November. My son received 18 months probation, 200 hours community service, and full restitution. My daughter-in-law received 30 months probation, a permanent bar from acting as agent or beneficiary on any real estate transaction in the state, and a restitution order that would follow her credit file for a decade. Neither of them served jail time. I hadn't asked for that. What I'd asked for was a record, the kind that can't be charmed or settled away, the kind that stays. The week after sentencing, Harold came over for coffee. We sat on the back porch in the November cool, the kind of Charleston afternoon that makes you understand why people stay here their whole lives. He asked me how I was doing. Not about the case, about me. I thought about it. Told him the house felt different than it had a year ago, when having family under the roof had still felt like something rather than a performance of something. Told him I wasn't sure if what I'd done had cost me my son or only revealed what was already true about where we stood. Harold said sometimes those were the same thing. I told him I was thinking about doing some pro bono work, estate fraud consultation for seniors who couldn't afford the kind of legal help I'd had access to. There were people who ended up in exactly the situation I'd almost been in, and who didn't have 31 years of real estate law to fall back on. Harold said he'd sit on the porch again anytime I needed a witness. I told him I hoped he wouldn't need to. That night I sat at the mahogany desk for the first time in months without feeling like I was in a contested space. The property deed was back in its folder, facing forward, in exactly the place it belonged. The brass key was back under the desk blotter. I looked at it for a while. They had spent months building what they thought was an unassailable plan. They'd studied my signature and copied it. They'd laid the groundwork for a narrative about cognitive decline. They'd found a buyer, a broker, a date. They'd planned very carefully, as my daughter-in-law had said on that night in front of my house, while I was 19 months away with binoculars and a legal pad. What they'd failed to account for was 31 years, not of decline, of preparation.